Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. Episode 47, The Captain. I came across an old newspaper article looking at the probate of Captain Charles Smith. And the probate came into a total of nearly £500,000, and this was in 1897. So this would equate to approximately $85 million today that he had in property and funds. So I was intrigued to find out about this man, how he amassed his fortune, and how his descendants fared. Captain Charles Smith was born in 1816 in Kerrymuir, Angus, Scotland, the son of John Smith and Elspeth Milne. He had 9 siblings, one of whom was a brother James, who was an architect in Melbourne. His father migrated to New South Wales in 1832 without his family, and he became a grazier and a founder of the wine industry at Kiamba in the Riverina. John Smith married again to Anne Wild in Sydney in the same year he arrived, despite still being married to Elspeth. Meanwhile, Elspeth became a spirits dealer and innkeeper in Scotland in 1841, and it seems that her children remained with her until they became of age. Some stayed in Scotland and others came to Australia, Charles being one of them. His mother died in 1856. On her death certificate it said that it was exacerbated by heavy drinking. John Smith and Anne Wild had 6 children together, so in total he was the father of 15 children, and one of those children from John and Anne was his stepbrother Robert, and he became a solicitor of Norton Smith & Co in Sydney. So Charles joined the Merchant Navy and served in the Baltic and the West Indies, and he immigrated to New South Wales in 1836, so 4 years after his father, and he turned to the whaling industry. In 1843 to 1850, he was the master of the colonial bark Woodlark. So within 7 years of him arriving as a young man, he was able to master his own ship. The Woodlark's departures and arrivals at the port of Sydney indicate the spirit with which he conducted his business. His first voyage appears to be when he sailed on the 24th of September 1843, and he returned on the 28th of February 1845 with 1,100 barrels of sperm oil. He sailed again soon afterwards and returned on the 18th of November 1845. He sailed again on the 14th of December 1845 and returned on the 29th of January 1847, bringing back sperm and black oil. Charles married Elizabeth Ann Bennett at Parramatta on the 2nd of March 1847 when Anne was 16 and Charles was 31, and they had 4 children together. He sailed again on the 16th of April 1847, so only within 6 weeks of his marriage, and returned to port on the 3rd of November to recruit. He had 350 barrels of sperm oil. He then went back again and resumed the voyage on the 16th of November and returned on the 16th of September 1848 with 400 more barrels of sperm oil. The next voyage concluded on the 20th of June 1849, and in this voyage Smith had called into Butaratari in the Gilbert Islands, in which he commenced a partnership with Richard Randall that continued until 1873. On the 12th of December 1849, in the Woodlark, he again arrived from a whaling voyage with sperm oil, and this time he listed his passengers as Mrs. Smith and child and servant, so choosing to take his wife with him on that voyage. The next arrival was on the 26th of November 1850. He had 700 barrels of sperm oil, 40 barrels of coconut oil, and a 100 weight, which is 51 kilograms, of tortoise shell that he obtained at the islands. In 1851, he paid £750 for the schooner Supply, and the next year he became a captain of the whaler Chieftain, and he made his final voyage on the Chieftain that left Pitts Island on the 11th of December 1851 and arrived in Sydney on the 10th of January 1852 with coconut oil and sundries. The Chieftain sailed thereafter with other masters, but Smith then became an agent for that and other ships, and he was employed by Flour Salting and Co. as a manager. After some business ventures with J.H. Challis, Smith then acquired a wharf at Bettington Street, Millers Point in 1854, and this was soon known as Smith's Wharf. And there was an article in the paper stating Morton Co. sold the wharf and stores at Millers Point, and the former lot was leased to Captain Charles Smith at £360 per annum, and the lease is until the 30th of June 1856. He made a voyage as a passenger. He was listed on the brig Phantom that was arriving in Sydney on the 15th of October 1854, no doubt to continue his links to Gilbert Islands. And then it mentions in November 1855 the brig Phantom and the brig Packet, both the property of Captain Charles Smith, are fast approaching the completion of their repairs, consisting of remasting and new try-works, and when they will be immediately dispatched for the South Sea fishery. In December 1855, it mentions how the Maid of Australia, a ketch that was 40 tonne, Captain MacDonald from the Solomon Islands via Moreton Bay, and the agent was Captain Charles Smith for that voyage. And then on the 28th of July 1856, it mentions the Almeida from the South Sea Islands, 120 tonnes of coconut oil, and Captain Charles Smith is mentioned again. There was an inquiry in Sydney about the piloting of ships coming in to the wharfs, and there were a range of captains that were interviewed with this. And this just gave a little insight into where Captain Charles Smith was at with his business dealings. So this is in November 1857. And it says, Captain Charles Smith examined by the senior warden. You have commanded ships out of this port, I believe. And Captain Charles Smith responded with, yes, for 8 or 9 years. And you are the owner of several ships trading out of this port? And he answers, yes. He said, have you considered all the question of expense of maintaining these vessels? And Charles responded with, I should think that a good vessel might be obtained for about £1,500 and about 10% on that annually for wear and tear. And he said, have you entered into the consideration of wages and provisions for the men? And he said, I would have 4 hands with the master and pilot. Later in the decade, he competed with Robert Towns, and Robert Towns described him as that sweep of a neighbour who sticks at nothing. Robert Towns was a competitor of Charles's in the whaling industry, and I couldn't help myself just to check what his probate was at the time of his death. And his probate came into £74,000. So quite a bit less than what his competitor ended up with in the end. On the 12th of September 1859, it mentions a letter that was written to Captain Charles Smith from the Eliza, and it says, information of the loss of the Eliza on the South Sea Islands has reached Sydney. The intelligence is contained in a letter to Captain Charles Smith, of which the following is a copy. Tahiti, the 4th of July, 1859. Dear Sir, it becomes my painful duty to advise you of the loss of the Eliza, which occurred on the 14th of February. The reckoned cargo saved was sold by auction and produced $1,175. So as mentioned before, how the Maid of Australia with Captain MacDonald had sailed to the Solomon Islands. Well, one of the partners in Flour Salting Co. was Alexander MacDonald, and by 1863 Smith was in partnership with MacDonald, and they were known as MacDonald, Smith and Co. as general merchants. In 1864, Charles was a committee man of the New South Wales Free Trade Association. In 1867 and 1868, he was a member of the commission that prepared for the naval reception of the Duke of Edinburgh. And in 1869, he sat on an Imperial Royal Commission into the alleged kidnapping of natives of the Loyalty Islands. He was clearly well respected in the shipping field. By 1867, his private address was listed as Rosebank at 199 William Street, Sydney. In February 1875, there was a notice from the Department of Lands saying the erection of wharf on piles. Notice is hereby given that application has been made by Captain Charles Smith for permission to erect a wharf on piles at Miller's Point. So he's expanding. By 1876, the family was living at Goderic, 17 Upper William Street North in Woolloomooloo Hill, which is now known as King's Cross. Between 1830 and 1833, Thomas McCoyd, the Sheriff of the Supreme Court of New South Wales, built the home, and after McCoyd's suicide in 1841, Goderic Lodge was occupied by William Grant Broughton, the first Anglican bishop in Australia. Broughton then returned to England in 1852, and the house passed through several owners, including Captain Charles Smith, and it did state in the information on the home that it was demolished around 1915. Charles's wife Anne died in 1876 when she was only 46, and Charles went on to marry Marjorie Hewison in August 1878 at Nain Cottage, Parramatta, when he was 62 and Marjorie 34, and they had 3 children together. Marjorie died in 1908. So in 1878, the year that he was married, he put some property up for sale. It was titled Valuable City Property, Darling Harbour, adjoining the gas company's property and the Grafton Wharf, the property of Captain Charles Smith. In January 1881, there was an advertisement in the paper to the public. Hardy and Gorman will submit to public competition under instruction from the Honourable John Lucas MLC. Anniversary Day, Wednesday the 26th of January, on the grounds of the charmingly situated, easily reached and grand block of elevated land at Lucasville, adjoining the mountain homes of Captain Charles Smith and R.C. Want, Esquire. And this mountain home that's referred to is what the family called Logie. Charles purchased the land in the 1870s from John Lucas, and in the 1880s he built a house that he called Logie. When Charles died, Logie was inherited by his son Colin. So Charles retired from active business around 1888. So Charles died at the age of 80 of an embolism on the 27th of June 1897 at his home, Goderic in King's Cross, and he was buried in the Presbyterian section of the Rookwood Cemetery. So on the 29th of June 1897, it outlines the funeral. It says, Captain Charles Smith, a very old colonist, died at his residence, Goderic, Bayswater Road, on Sunday last. The deceased gentleman came to New South Wales over 60 years ago and was a well-known figure in commercial circles. He was born in Scotland and arrived in the colony in 1836. In the early days, he went to sea. He engaged in the whaling industry and made Sydney his headquarters. He commenced business at Smith's Wharf, Miller's Point, as a ship owner and general merchant, and had a number of joint ventures with the late John Henry Challis. For a long time, he was a member of the old Pilot Board, which preceded the present Marine Board, which was what he was answered questions for in an earlier article. And about the year 1863, joined the late Mr. Alexander MacDonald as a partner in the well-known firm MacDonald Smith & Co., general merchants of Hunter Street. In his time, he occupied the positions of chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, auditor of the Commercial Banking Company of Sydney, Director of the Bank of New South Wales, Trustee of the Savings Bank of New South Wales, a member of the Council of St Andrews College. He was the founder of the Australian General Assurance Company, which merged into the Alliance Assurance Company. The deceased was twice married and leaves 3 sons and 2 daughters. His property includes, besides what he owns in New South Wales, stations in New Zealand, Western Australia and Victoria. And then on the death of Captain Charles Smith, it says that he started out early to search for his fortune on the seas after coming to Australia. He was about 20 when he landed here. He rose to the rank of ship's captain and entered into the trading business and whaling, and carried his operations far off on the Australian coast. He was a considerable trader and investor. Much of his money he put into landed property, such as Smith's Wharf, and other evidences of wise foresight amply testify today. But this only represents a comparative modicum of the success that followed the energy with which he threw himself into his varied pursuits. He was a cautious man, and he was a descendant of a race that was eminently thrifty and careful. Mr. Smith continued to plunge with the spirit of mercantile adventure into commercial transactions that steadily grew under economic management and prudent nursing. In a word, Captain Smith amassed a vast fortune. He used to be a partner in the firm McDonald Smith & Co. In all his investments, he took an active and continuous interest. Public life had no attraction for him, and as a consequence, outside business circles, he was little known. On the 12th of October 1897, in the will of the late Captain Charles Smith, the total amount of duty paid upon probates and administration, the amount of probate on the estate of Captain Charles Smith was £25,556. And in his will that was dated on the 24th of December 1896, he appoints his wife Marjorie Smith, and after her decease, his son John Robert Smith and his friend Edmund Fosbury, Inspector General of Police, to be his testamentary guardians and guardians of his will. So he bequeathed to his wife an immediate legacy of £1,000 for her own use and benefit absolutely, all of his household effects, including his carriage and horses, and the city residence Goderic, and his country residence known as Logie, upon trust during the life or widowhood of his wife for the use of herself and unmarried children. He provided annuities to his clerk, bookkeeper and storekeeper, and he empowered his trustees to sell, call in, collect or convert into money portions of his residuary estate that did not consist of money and divide it into 4 shares. The first one to his son John Robert Smith and his wife, £200 per annum, and also shares that they may see fit to educate and maintain the children of John Robert Smith. The second share for his son Henry William Smith and his wife and children. The third share to his son-in-law William Charles Hill during his life, and subject thereto he direct provisions to be made for the education and maintenance of his granddaughter Edith Alice Rebecca Smith Hill until she gains 21 years. And the fourth share to his wife, the sum of £4,000 per annum, to be reduced as the children come of age. In the event of his wife marrying again, he directs that the annuity will be dropped from £4,000 to £1,000 per annum. And the children, once they attained 23 years, and £10,000 portion of the income referred to, bequeathed to his son Colin Smith when he attains 23 years. So, as mentioned, his estate was valued for probate at £494,468. In 1902, it was mentioned that Captain Smith's widow still lived at Goderic. There was an article also in 1902 mentioning that the old cottage of Captain Smith at the entrance to the wharf still stands, but there are indications that the Harbour Trust requires the ground and another old landmark must go. So Charles's children with Elizabeth Bennet. Charles David was born at Parramatta in September 1848, and Charles followed his father's footsteps in the merchant trade. And in 1876, Charles David Smith joined the firm McDonald Smith & Co. So he joined the family firm at that time. And he died on the 2nd of April 1883. He was aged only 32, and it was at his father's residence in Sydney, Goderic. The executors of the late Mr. Charles David Smith have written to Captain Broomfield, the Honorary Treasurer of the Shipwreck Relief Society, intimating that the assets of the deceased gentleman's estate are now ready for distribution, and that as by the terms of the will, 1/7 of the net proceeds of the estate is bequeathed to the Society. They were prepared to hand over a cheque for the amount of £1,984. The Sydney Female Refuge and the Institution for the Deaf and Dumb have received cheques from the executors for a like sum, while the Sydney Ragged School is enriched to the extent of £992 from Mr. Smith's estate. Mr. Charles J. Smith has set a noble example to wealthy members of the community. John Robert, the second child, he was born on the 2nd of September 1851. He was a Queensland cattleman and he owned Tucker Tucker Station at Texas on the Queensland border. He married Adeline Williams at Kogarah, New South Wales in 1887, and they had 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. His son, Alan Smith, finished off his education in England at one of the great public schools in the old country, Cheltenham, and he received further tuition at the London University. So John Robert was known as a popular Australian sportsman and breeder. He owned the highly successful stallion Gozo, who had given the turf many good winners. And then it says that a private cable message received yesterday announced the death in Paris of Mrs. J.R. Smith, late of Tuckatucka Station on the McIntyre River. Mrs. Smith and her husband were very well known in Sydney and in the pastoral northwest during their long residence at Tuckatucka. So they went over to England for a stay, and his wife unexpectedly died in Paris, and John returned to Australia from England in 1911. So an article mentions, after an extended residence in England, Mr. J.R. Smith returned to Sydney during the week with his family. The veteran sportsman never looked better, in fact much like he was in the palmy days of the Tuckatucka Stud, which he founded and made great success of. When Mr. Smith decided to retire for a term in England and sell Tuckatucka, it was the largest stud of thoroughbreds in Australia and was noted for the large percentage of winners it turned out. Pilot Boy and Sadur were the first big winners it turned out, and then followed the Chief and 2 Melbourne Cup winners, the Grafter and Gaulis. They were all raised by Mr. Smith. And on the 25th of August 1922, it was announced that John had passed away, and there was an obituary in the paper. Mr. J.R. Smith, a well-known grazier, died at his residence, Green Oaks Cottage, Darling Point, this morning. He was 71. He was the owner of Tuckatucka Station near Yetman. Throughout his life, he was closely connected with the turf and in the old days raced under his own colours. He was a familiar figure in the sporting community of Sydney. Mr. Smith underwent an operation some months ago and his health had been indifferent since. Captain Charles Smith's third child, a daughter, Alice Rebecca, was born on the 11th of April 1853. She married William Charles Hill on the 20th of August 1874 when she was 21 and William was 36. And it says, the ships in the harbour were yesterday gaily dressed as compliment to Captain Charles Smith on the occasion of the marriage of his daughter. Captain Smith has for many years been connected with mercantile and maritime interests of this port. Alice and William had one daughter, Edith Alice, on the 2nd of September 1875, but Alice died 8 days after the birth of her daughter in Sydney. And then Mr. W.C. Hill passed away in 1919, and there's some information that gives us a bit of an insight into who he was and his interests. So the death occurred at his residence, Rancliffe, Ocean Street, Edgecliff, on Saturday in his 81st year. William Charles Hill, MLC, of the well-known firm Hill, Clark & Co., wool brokers and stock and station agents. He was the son of the late Mr. Richard Hill, MLC, and spent a greater part of his life in New South Wales. He was born in Sydney. His early life was mainly spent in the country. The late Mr. Hill's name was closely linked with the Butterbone estate on the Macquarie River below Warren, one of the best equipped stations in Australia. He was managing director of Butterbone. The deceased was a very prominent pigeon shot in his younger days. He was always intimately associated with the turf and had interests in racehorses, latterly in Gadabout, Rushford, Irritation and Gallipoli. For over 25 years, he was the chairman of directors at Rosehill Racing Club, and he was a large shareholder. He was appointed a member of the Legislative Council some years ago. He'd married a daughter of Captain Charles Smith, but Mrs. Hill died many years ago, leaving a daughter, Miss Edith Hill, who was an active worker for the Red Cross, the War Chest and other organisations. The fourth child, Henry William, was born on the 3rd of May 1855 at Millers Point. It was mentioned in 1897 that Harry, as he was known, Harry Smith, was one of the best pigeon shooters this colony boasted of. He married Alice Blake at Yass in 1882 when he was 27 and his wife was 19. They had 5 children. Harry died in New Zealand aged 60 at Wakaraka and was buried in Auckland. The title of the article says, Burnt to Death, Too Big to be Saved. During a fire in a boarding house at Auckland, Henry William Smith, aged 60, a visitor from Sydney, was burnt to death. The proprietor made heroic attempts to save him, but owing to the deceased's great bulk, was unable to move him, so was compelled to leave him to his fate. And his daughter Ruth married in May 1914 in the St James's Church in Piccadilly, London. She married Charles A.W. Delmar Cavendish of London. So Ruth Madeline Smith was her full name, youngest daughter of the late H.W. Smith of Sydney and granddaughter of Captain Charles Smith. And it says a very smart wedding took place at St James's Piccadilly on the 30th of March 1914, when Mr Charles Delmar Cavendish of the P&O Service married Miss Ruth Smith. There were very notable guests at this wedding. So among those invited were Princess Pignatelli of Aragon, who was aunt of the bridegroom, Count Gaston de la Rochefoucauld, grandfather of the bridegroom, Earl Carnworth, Earl and Lady Paulette, Sir Philip and Lady Grey Edgerton, Sir John and Lady Fuller, Count and Countess Puzlowska, Prince Ludovic Pignatelli, and it says the bridegroom's sister, Mrs. Winslow Holt, who was Madame Delmar Hall, was unable to be present as she is living in South Australia. And after the reception, the bride and bridegroom left for the Riviera and Biarritz. So as mentioned, when Ruth married in 1914, Harry had died, and he died on the 19th of May 1913, so 12 months prior to his daughter's wedding. Unfortunately, Ruth's marriage to Charles Cavendish didn't last. There was a divorce that occurred in 1926 in London. The hearing of the application for the divorce of Ruth Cavendish from Charles Cavendish, a ship's purser, concluded yesterday. Mrs. Dunlop, sister of the petitioner, gave evidence that she had frequently seen the respondent, Cavendish, kissing Miss Forrow. It was purely platonic, said witness, the same as he kissed me, which he often did. Mrs. Dunlop was cross-examined on the subject of platonic kissing. Do you think it proper for a married man to kiss a girl, call her darling and send his love to her? Asked counsel. I come from Australia, retorted Mrs. Dunlop. We don't think about these things. We have a plain sort of mind. The counsel said, do you do these things? And she said, absolutely. Supposing, suggested counsel, your husband was carrying on with Miss Moreau, kissing her and continually calling her darling? He does. And you don't mind? Certainly not, witness added. I wouldn't mind if my husband carried on with any number of women. That may not be typical of Australia, but it is certainly typical of me. And there was laughter in the court. The long cross-examination of Miss Moreau on the subject of when and where she kissed Cavendish was another feature of the hearing. The counsel asked, how long after your meeting with him was it he first kissed you? She said, a year. Did you kiss him in front of his wife? She said, I think so. You didn't kiss his wife? No, certainly not. Is it a common thing for you to kiss gentlemen? My friends' husbands have often kissed me. Miss Moreau said that while travelling at sea, she always kissed Cavendish good night. She was not aware of any reason for doing so. It was probably force of habit. She frequently drank a cocktail in his cabin. The counsel said, I suppose this kissing is still proceeding at this present day? She said, yes. And you will continue it even if no decree is granted? She said, certainly. Do you think that will help reunite the couple? She said, I don't know. The judge asked, do you care? And she said, no. Mrs. Brands gave evidence of meeting Cavendish on board ship and staying at a Sydney hotel. She said that she requested Cavendish to call her Dorothy. She was never in Cavendish's company alone and was not aware that his wife objected to her. She had returned specially from India to attend the hearing. She was separated from her husband in 1915. She went to dances and the races with Cavendish in Sydney in 1921. Cavendish had been specially asked to look after her on the voyage, but she would have been extremely annoyed had he kissed her. When she asked for an introduction to his wife, Cavendish said his wife was always rude to his women friends. Evidence was called to show that Cavendish had a party of friends at a West End flat when it was alleged that he was seen in Miss Moreau's flat. Cavendish gave evidence, and he said that his wife was neurotic and jealous. The marriage was so unhappy that they agreed, though living under the same roof, to go their own ways without question, and they finally separated in 1924. He admitted that Brand was partly the cause of his separation from his wife. Cavendish accused his wife of intemperance and untruthfulness. He denied that he himself was intemperate. He denied helping to pay the rent of Moreau's flat. Mrs. Cavendish was granted a decree. Patricia was given custody of the daughter. Within 9 months of the divorce, Charles Cavendish did marry Marguerite Moreau on the 4th of December 1926 in London. Charles's children with Marjorie Hewison. The first child born was Colin, and there was an article titled A Fashionable Wedding. A large and fashionable gathering at St John's Church, Darlinghurst yesterday for the wedding of Mr Colin Smith, youngest son of the late Captain Charles Smith of Godric, and Miss Ethel Mackenzie, youngest daughter of Colonel and Mrs Mackenzie, the Bungalow, Victoria Barracks. The guests included Sir Edmund Barton and Lady Barton, Sir John and Lady C, Sir Edward and Lady Hutton, the Lord and Lady Mayoress, Senator and Mrs Gould, Mr R Smith, Brigadier General, and Mrs Finn. Colin and Ethel lived at Logie, the Blue Mountains family rural property, and he established a bacteriological laboratory at Logie as he was a bacteriologist of some repute. Colin was known to be a rather colourful eccentric who drove Stanley steamers and shot flies off the walls with a pistol. In 1921, Logie and its estate were sold. The next child was Winifred May. Winifred married Leslie Wilson, who was later Sir Leslie Wilson, Governor of Queensland, and she married him in 1909. In 1914, he was known as Captain Leslie Orme Wilson, who had just been elected to the House of Commons as a member of Reading. So they had moved to England. So Leslie was born in 1876. He was of the Royal Marines. He saw service in South Africa, where he won a Distinguished Service Order in 1900. And he was the aide-de-camp to the Governor of New South Wales from 1903 to 1909. He served through the operations at Gallipoli, and then he was made a companion of St Michael and St George. And it mentions in 1923, Mrs Leslie Wilson, wife of Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Wilson, who has been nominated as the Governor of Bombay, will have the distinction of being the first Australian to be a governor's wife. She was Miss Winifred Smith, daughter of late Captain Charles Smith of Sydney. Her home was at Godric, Darlinghurst, facing Bayswater Road and Walcott Street, and was in an extensive private house with beautiful grounds. And there's a beautiful photo that I'll put on my Facebook page, and it's called An Unveiling Ceremony in Bombay. The Governor of Bombay, Sir Leslie Wilson, and Lady Wilson, at the ceremonial unveiling of a statue of the Prince of Wales, given by the Aga Khan. The next child, Marjorie, Mr Gilbert de la Port-Nugent, RN, of HMS Swiftsure, Home Fleet, and he was the eldest son of Sir John Nugent Bart and Lady Nugent of Cloncocaran, County Waterford, Ireland. And on Friday the 2nd of December 1904, there was an article, Approaching Society Marriage, Lieutenant Nugent and Marjorie Smith, Question of Guardianship. The attention of the Chief Judge in Equity was occupied this morning with an application respecting the approaching marriage of Miss Marjorie Smith, daughter of the late Captain Charles Smith, to Lieutenant Nugent RN. Miss Smith is 18 years of age, and the question of guardianship was engaged in the court. Miss Smith is to be married to Lieutenant Nugent about Christmas time, and this was in regard to the fourth share that Mrs Smith received with her children that weren't quite of age. And it says, Mrs Smith is well known to you as the widow of the late Captain Charles Smith, a former director of your bank, and she writes to us to say that her daughter, Miss Marjorie Smith, will be married to Lieutenant Nugent, and in accordance with her written request, we've cabled you £500 to be paid to her for her trousseau. But in addition, we have arranged to pay for the benefit of Miss Marjorie from the date of her marriage until the time she is 23, in accordance with her father's will, the sum of £1,500 per annum that we will pay quarterly. So the request was for not only her mother to be able to sign this off, but also to have a solicitor in London to sign this off, as that was where Marjorie was living. So His Honour appointed Mrs Smith and David George of London guardians of the estate of Miss Marjorie Smith and sanctioned the payment of the allowance of £1,500 per annum in respect to her. So in Sydney on the 8th of March 1905, there is an article referring to their wedding, an Anglo-Australian wedding. By a recent mail, news has been received in Sydney of the marriage in St Andrew's Church of Miss Marjorie Smith, daughter of the late Captain Charles Smith of Godric, Darlinghurst, and Lieutenant Gilbert R. de la Port-Nugent, RN, son of Sir John and Lady Nugent of Waterford. And after Marjorie's death in 1908, it says, by order of the executors of Mrs. Captain Charles Smith, Walter Bradley and Company will hold an important auction sale of household effects at the late residence of the deceased, Godric, Bayswater Road, Darlinghurst. The articles will be unique collections of works of art, embracing exquisite samples of rare Oriental, French and English porcelain, valuable French bronzes, watercolours by distinguished Australian artists, old Spanish mahogany furniture, Louis XVI timepiece and side candlesticks, surmounted by bronze cupids and satyrs. On the 20th of October 1909, by order of the Perpetual Trustee Company, executors of the will has a property choice position at Manly, Stancombe, a faithfully built, highly finished, well-designed and commodious residence with 1 acre at the corner of Osborne and Addison Roads, 5 minutes walk to the pier and close to ocean and bay beaches. And on the 13th of February 1923, Royal Chambers sold for £80,000, an historic site. An historic city site on the corner of Castlereagh and Hunter Street, on which are comparatively old premises known as Royal Chambers, has been sold on behalf of the Perpetual Trustee Company for £80,000. In the early days of Sydney's history, the property was known as Tattersall's Chambers. The property has been held in the estate of the late Captain Charles Smith for many years. And on the 3rd of March 1910, we come to the Equity Court, and the title is A Grandfather's Will. The Perpetual Trustee Company, in an action in which Henry Charles Smith and Alfred Henry Dellery are the defendants, seek to obtain an order from the court in regards to Smith's interest under the will of his grandfather. By his will, dated December 24th, 1896, Captain Charles Smith, having made certain specific devises and given certain legacies, bequeathed the residue of his real and personal property to the plaintiff company upon trust, directing that the net balance should be divided equally into 4 parts. The first of those shares directed to be held in trust, then the income of the sum of £200 per annum should be paid to his son John Robert Smith and his wife, and also for the maintenance and education of their children. If there was surplus of income on compound interest, then they were ordered to pay such accumulations to the children of John Robert when they attained the age of 21 years, or to the daughters on the occasion of their marriage. The second share was to go to Henry William Smith, his wife and their children, and it was further directed that if any beneficiary under the will should become bankrupt, the legacy or annuity should cease, and the trustees, however, could be given the authority to continue the payments if they saw fit. So the names and ages of the children of Henry William Smith, Charles's son, were Henry Charles Smith, Alice Elizabeth Smith, Mary Josephine Smith, John W. Smith, Ruth Smith. Mrs. Smith, their mother, died in 1906. And in 1904 and 1906, it was declared that Henry Charles Smith was not entitled to be paid any portion of the accumulations of the income. However, in July 1906, under the powers contained in the will, on behalf of Henry Charles Smith and Alice Elizabeth Smith, there was an advance of £7,359 for the purpose of discharging liabilities. It is further alleged that they were informed by the defendant, Alfred Henry Dellery, that Henry Charles Smith had incurred great liabilities to sundry creditors, amounting to over £6,000. The defendant, H.C. Smith, could not admit many of the allegations made on behalf of the company and stated that the £7,359, that the liabilities were incurred by him and his sister on account of their mother and not themselves. He did not know and could not admit that the company had been informed that he had incurred liabilities amounting to a little over £6,000. So on the 23rd of August 1910, this issue has gone to the High Court. Smith versus the Perpetual Trustee Company and another. This was an appeal from the Equity Court decree on March the 10th, where it declared that the execution by Henry Charles Smith, the appellant, of a power of attorney and a letter dated on the 25th of September 1907 to the Perpetual Trustee Company Limited constituted an assignment of his right, title and interest under his grandfather's will and operated as a forfeiture of his right, title under the said will. The facts were that Captain Charles Smith, a very wealthy man, died in June 1897 and gave the whole residue of his estate upon trust to sell and convert after paying all debts. He directed the proceeds of sale to be divided into 4 equal parts, which he defined. He ordered the trustees to hold the first part on trust, firstly to pay out the income to his son, John Robert Smith, and his present wife, the sum of £200 per annum each, and to apply such portions as they thought fit thereafter for the education of any child or children of their issue. The accumulated surplus and resulting income was to be divided in equal portions amongst all children of John Robert Smith, whose living males attained the age of 21 years, or females who attained that age or married. The second share was to be held in trust for Henry William Smith and his present wife and their issue in the same manner. The will contained a forfeiture clause providing that if any persons entitled to a legacy or annuity adjudged bankrupt or assign or change his benefits under the will, or by any act or default or operation of the law be deprived of personal enjoyment or benefit thereof, such as a legacy, annuity, a share or benefit should lapse, if he or she were dead. Henry William Smith was still alive, but his wife died on December the 6th, 1905, leaving 5 children, of whom the appellant was the eldest. In September 1907, H.C. Smith owed a number of debts and was attempting to pay them. Among his creditors was the joint respondent, A.H. Dellery, who was acting as his solicitor, to whom he owed money. Smith executed the power of attorney in favour of Dellery, empowering him to demand, sue for and recover all money payable to the appellant by the trustees of this estate to pay his debts. On the same day, he signed a letter addressed to the respondents, informing them that he had arranged with Dollery to pay his creditors out of his income, as it felt due, and requesting them to pay all future income and any portion to which he might become entitled to his power of attorney, whose receipts would be a sufficient discharge. The Chief Judge in Equity held that the forfeiture had taken place by virtue of these documents, and the decision was appealed against on the grounds that His Honour should have held the execution by appellant of the power of attorney, and the letter did not constitute an assignment and did not operate as a forfeiture of his right, title and interest in the will, that such execution operated in law merely as the appointment of an agent, and that under the circumstances they could not operate as a forfeiture of an appellant's right, title or interest under the will. On the 16th of March 1910, the decision was made, and the article is titled A Grandfather's Will. The Perpetual Trustee Company, in an action in which Henry Charles Smith and Alfred Henry Dollery are the defendants, sought to obtain an order from the court in regards to Smith's interests under the will of his grandfather. His Honour stated in the course of his judgment that it appeared that during the life of H.W. Smith, H.C. Smith only took such portion of the income as the trustees thought fit to allow him, so that the question of forfeiture was of no great consequence till his father's death. In that event, it was of great moment to him whether his share of the capital was forfeited or not. It appeared that H.C. Smith had been, and he supposed still was, of extravagant habits, and though his debts had been paid more than once, he owed to various creditors in September 1907 a sum of £6,000. Among his creditors was the defendant, A.H. Dollery, who was acting as his solicitor, to whom he owed £530. £280 to the defendant himself and £250 to him on behalf of his brother. It was shown by the evidence that neither H.C. Smith nor the defendant Dollery intended to execute any document which would work as a forfeiture. He held that a forfeiture had taken place by virtue of the letter and the power of attorney, and thus it became unnecessary to consider whether the order of the foreign attachment had caused a forfeiture. If there had been an agreement between H.C. Smith and the defendant Dollery that the power of attorney should be revocable or should come into operation only in certain events, the result might have been different, but there was no evidence of such an agreement. An order was made that the costs of all parties should come out of the income which the trustee company has discretionary power to apply for the benefit of H.C. Smith. So basically what it is saying is that the solicitor wanted to be paid, and so they've gone together to hope to get further money from the estate. And it was clear, though, that the solicitor could not do so. It had to go through H.C. Smith. So as a result, parties were paid out of the money from the will, but it had to go to the High Court in order for that to happen. Furthermore, in October 1913, in the Equity Court, the Perpetual Trustee Company versus Smith says a further question arising out of the will of the late Charles Smith of Goderic, Upper William Street, was submitted to the court. The defendants were Henry Charles Smith, Alice Elizabeth Smith, Mary Josephine Dunlop, John Wallace Smith, Ruth Smith an infant, and Henry Charles Smith an infant, all of whom, with the exception of the last named, are grandchildren of the testator and children of Henry William Smith, now deceased. His Honour was asked to decide whether, upon the true construction of the will, and in the events that had happened, the plaintiff company was entitled to distribute the realised portion of the second share under the will among those children of Henry William Smith after they attained the age of 21 years. It was explained that Henry William Smith, having died, the question arose as to whether the shares of his children had become absolutely vested or whether such shares were practically confined to life interest. Interesting that the sixth defendant was in fact Henry Charles Smith's son, who had been born some months ago. So Henry Charles is ensuring not only is he included in this, but also his son. The question the court had to decide was whether, in the events which had happened, the children of Henry Charles Smith who had attained the age of 21 became, on the death of their father, entitled to receive their share of his interest in the estate, or whether each share was subject to a gift over to any grandchildren of H.W. Smith, in the event of any child of H.W. Smith dying at any time leaving issue. The point really was whether the children of H.W. Smith, having survived their father, took an absolute interest in the property, or whether their children still had a reversionary interest. His Honour was of the opinion that there were indications that the testator intended that the period of distribution, that is, the death of H.W. Smith, to be the period of absolute vesting. He held that the shares of the children of H.W. Smith had become absolutely vested. So basically what the judge was saying was that each of the children of Harry Smith were entitled absolutely to the share, and this can occur immediately. So there were no ties or conditions according to that. So it seems that Captain Charles Smith was a very enterprising man and certainly did very well for himself in Australia. He seemed to work himself from the ground up. He didn't have family money behind him. And it seems that a majority of his children went on to marry quite influential people and live very comfortable lives themselves. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes